Welcome to this book launch event. I'm so excited about this. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I run comms for Library Juice Academy and Library Juice Press, and I get to do fun things like set up these book launch events. I am just going to do a quick introduction about Library Juice and then pass it over to our wonderful panelists. Our press that publishes theoretical and practical issues in librarianship, which I think a lot of you may be familiar with. So we publish books such as the one that we'll be hearing about today, which is, I think, really great. We are an imprint of Litwin Books, so you can find more about us at litwinbooks.com. In addition to books, we also host journals. We've got a couple of them now. We've got the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, which explores innovative research that critiques current and prevailing paradigms in LIS. And also recently, we started hosting the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship, which looks at critical approaches to the field of digital librarianship. So please do check out those journals to stay up to date on all the amazing critical work going on in the field. And of course, reach out about submitting your own work, because we always want to continue to learn more, grow together as a field. We've got a lot going on this week. In addition to this event, we'll be back with the editors of this book in 2 days for part 2, in which we'll be hearing from other authors. And then tomorrow, we'll be having an event for building our own critiques, narratives, and practices by community college library workers of color. There are 2 QR codes there for registering to those events. I'll also drop these links into the chat as soon as I'm done talking about this, because you won't want to miss any of these. They're really fantastic works coming out right now. Speaking of all the stuff going on with us, please do feel free to follow along on, what are these? Let's see, Facebook and Mastodon and Blue Sky and Instagram and all the places that you like to go and scroll. We are there talking about our stuff. That's everything. I'm so excited to step aside at this point and turn it over to our panel. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, Sophie, thank you so much. We really appreciate all you've done to help us make this work and for having us here today. And it's really special for us to get to share our work. So big thank you to Sophie. Music information literacy, inclusion, and advocacy was first born from a significant paradigm shift in our country. But let me back up a little bit first and talk a little about where we were that led us to this moment. Back in 2018, I edited a book called Ideas, Strategies, and Scenarios in Music Information Literacy. And much of that book was really conceived and written in the early stages of the ACRL framework. And it was a super rich time of change, as you all know. And it brought about new skills that moved information literacy away from kind of competency standards towards a more complex set of core concepts associated with meta-literacy and cognition. And so that was a big shift at that time. Well, this book grew out of another significant shift. The last decade's events have increased public awareness of DEIAJ issues dramatically. And additionally, we've had some understandings grow and deepen around issues of, for example, systemic racism and gender beyond the binary. And so all of those old thoughts are starting to be challenged. And becoming a more equitable librarian, it's an ongoing process. And it's only natural to sort of refocus our teaching and, the ways we teach and assist students after a significant cultural paradigm shift. So this process is the space that we're in now, is where critical information literacy overlaps with self-reflection as a librarian, and also a deeper understanding that our students, our faculty, our colleagues, we all have identities and experiences that influence how we navigate our world.
Also, that was Kathy Abromeit. I'm Dyani Sabin. We're the co-editors of this volume. Yes, haven't seen our faces before. As we were approaching this book and thinking about the overall structure of it, we came up with three main concepts or sections that we really wanted represented. The first part of the book, Critical Theories, Concepts, and Reflections, offers a philosophical overview of society and culture to attempt to reveal, critique, and challenge power structures. As librarians, we encourage practices that allow us to operate in a way that embraces awareness of the social, political, and cultural relationships in which our library users reside. Today, you'll hear from Liz Lang and Shannon Simpson as they talk about engaging students in anti-racist information literacy through critical assessment. In addition, you'll hear from Nurhak, Bayramli, and Juliet and Boykins as they talk about music information literacy advocacy at historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And finally, in this section, Karen Olson will discuss teaching critical information literacy using Stephen Foster's statue. The second section, bringing underrepresentation to the forefront, is about visibility. It's driven by the lived experiences of its authors and the importance of making both space in library instruction and in physical library spaces for a diverse population of users and librarians. Today, you'll hear from Holling Smith-Borne, and he'll guide us through his chapter, Information Literacy Beyond the Binary. The third section, Supporting Activism, is largely about expanding and supporting activism within the system of the library itself. Tim Keller will talk about the problematic language of subject headings, and Gary Galván will share his work on decolonizing orchestral repertoire, a special collection vision.
The examples in this book are music, primarily because that's my discipline. But one could think about all of this as a case study and apply these assignments and approaches to any discipline. There's a kind of universal design appeal when you step out of the music librarian mode. The issues of visibility and awareness and comfort are all practices that can be applied to any library context, or for that matter, to any kind of public services field.
There is an element of existing as the other that allows for greater comfort for anyone who is marginalized. And being intentional about trying to open your space, it makes a bigger difference than most people realize. I think also one of the big takeaways of this book is that it is so important to try. Even if you're not sure you're doing something perfectly, but it's the act trying to create inclusive spaces that builds a lot of community value. We are incredibly privileged to have made this book with such amazing authors. They are truly walking the walk and doing the hard work. And with all that, we're excited to introduce you to Liz Lang and Shannon Simpson.
Hello, everyone. I think Shannon is going to share a quick slide deck that we created just to share some QR codes and some resources while we talk. So I'm Liz Lang, and I'm joined by Shannon Simpson from Kenyon College. And we are here as representatives for our Design Justice Research cohort who wrote the chapter on critical assessment. So there are quite a few of us that wrote this chapter, all of the bold here. And then we also included all of our student workers who collaborated with us as well. So our group started as a collaboration between the 5 colleges of Ohio during COVID to rethink how librarians could approach instruction through a design justice lens. Shannon, you want to go forward? So design justice is an approach to design that is led by marginalized communities that aims to explicitly challenge rather than reproduce structural inequities. Specifically, we are looking into how librarians can take a role of a facilitator to give students more power to control what and how they learn inside of our classrooms. So this chapter came out of the work of this group. So we did a lot of reading together. Then we started our research where we talked to students through surveys and focus groups across all 5 campuses, and then started to put into practice what we were learning. So during our conversations with our students, it became clear that assessment is how we can bring students more into the driver's seat of our library sessions. Shannon, can you go forward one? So this chapter combined the principles of design justice, which you can see here, and I'll throw the links into a chat so that you can get access to all of these lovely slides here in a second. And then also with Veronica Douglas's article on assessment of care. Again, one more slide, Shannon. So combining these two principles to turn assessment into a catalyst to build a critical information literacy classroom. So we designed this chapter to give practical advice on how to integrate critical assessment into your library classroom. But broadly, our recommendations are... Shannon, one more slide. Yeah. Okay. So first, recognize that some of your students may be more comfortable with power and taking control of their own learning than others. And then above all, listen to what your students are telling you. Transfer your power to students when possible, so giving them the agency to decide on content and format, etc. And then possibly the most important takeaway was to take a look at your session as a bridge between students, previous experiences, and how they can tie in what they've learned in your classroom to what they've been learning in the course and their everyday life. So we heard this over and over again as we were talking to students. They desperately wanted to see how what they were learning in a particular class connects with the other parts of their lives. Yet they needed our help to make sense of those connections. That leads to approaching your session with humility and flexibility. So when you're listening to students, you may learn that you are doing something wrong in real time and need to adjust as you are teaching. Finally, you can't really do this work alone. It's really hard, and it's going to only lead to burnout if you don't have a support structure. So find your co-collaborators, either with other librarians at your institution or like-minded faculty or externally in our profession. Okay, Shannon, would you want to take over and talk about how to get started with this work?
I sure would. Thanks, Elizabeth. So one of the ways, like we were just thinking about, like how could you actually get started with this? And the very first thing is, of course, and we're used to call it collaborators, but now we're calling it co-conspirators. But find those people that are kind of like-minded that also really want to do this sort of work together as well. And this also goes back a little bit more to like pedagogies of care, in that you are working together, you are not doing the work alone, that you are finding people that are driven and share your same values. So that can go a very long way. Next steps, read our chapter, of course, along with the rest of the book. Then kind of marinate with the design justice principles, and definitely spend some time with bell hooks if you haven't, and pedagogies of care. Those are our really important foundational kinds of material to start with. Then we thought you could brainstorm out some of the following questions. And instead of just thinking in a very limited way, like sometimes librarians were just like, well, we don't have money and we don't have time, and so we can't do this. Dream big and then scale back, and think about some of these questions, like what opportunities can you provide for students to have input when it comes to learning outcomes for a typical one-shot? What would that actually look like? How could you actually do that? What opportunities could you provide for students to have input in the assessment mechanisms? What would that look like in an ideal world? And then ask each of these questions together, separate, write them all down, and then come back together and see where you come to. Lastly, we only have a few minutes. So one of the things that we did think about, because we did write this, and you all may, hopefully you're teaching this. I always teach students, like from the time like an idea or a book, starts, it's many years, can be years. So how we would actually think about and do some new directions today, because a lot of the material, of course, is extremely still relevant, but focusing on information being about human beings was a big thing that we were thinking about. So I've taken like the SIFT method and verified, like those have all come out in the last couple of years, and they're really meaningful. I find their evaluation impacts really great, but I've taken SIFT and I've taken and added an H, and that's from design justice to think about a rubric of harm and help. So how does this information, who does this information harm? Who does this information help? Is it empowering? Who is my class designed to help? Who is my class harming? And then maybe your assessment, who does it actually reach? Who is it not reaching in my practice as well? Who has access to this? Who doesn't have access to this? So a lot of questions that now I would integrate more into my practice personally is about the human nature of information and the harm and the help of it, whether it's machine learning or AI or any of those things. They're having environmental impacts, they're having human impacts and consequences. And if we can actually start to assess what that is and relate those to students and have them start to think about that, I think that that's super important. And of course, just stepping in and empowering each other and empowering students is a huge part of this too. So thank you so much to our editors, to Design Justice, to Veronica, and the pandemic. We met in the pandemic. We started meeting online, so that's why I say thank you to the pandemic. I don't think we would have been as effective had we not had that wonderful experience that we all mutually went through. Sorry. Thank you so much.
So next we will hear from Nurhak and Juliet.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nurhak, and I'm the music librarian at Elizabeth State University. And it is an honor for me to introduce our collaborative work with Dr. Boykins, the director of our bands. And our book was born out of our collaborative shared mission, which is to empower our students to engage with music critically and confidently. So as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wisely said, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and think critically. So music information literacy is a critical component of this educational mission. It's about teaching our students to sift through the information that we provide for them, and that is also invisible in our archives. So this is a really good, timely publication that came in a really good critical time. It's even late, but there's never too late. So I'm so glad that it's published, and it's really critical. We needed this. But in the book, this is just the tip of the iceberg. In the book, there are things that we didn't have chance to mention. For example, our university archives was found by Leonard Ballou, and whose wife was secretary to Dr. Martin Luther King. And we have archives here with his published work that is not really visible online. So we were not able to highlight these collections that are really important to our institution. In the book, however, we discussed mainly about conversation, how to initiate the conversation with the students, integrating popular genres, not only classical music, but the genres that would push them to critical thinking, and the cultural impact that Kathleen, our editor, mentioned, the cultural shift. So the genres hip hop and jazz become a conversational gateway, always, in our library instructions. So I aim to advocate for that supports students academically, but finding a getaway to scholarly conversation through the topics that they are comfortable talking with. So now I'm going to start talking here, and I would like to introduce Dr. Boykins and let her talk about her portion.
Thank you, Ms. Nora. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I don't know what it is where you are, but hello. I am Dr. Boykins, and I am the director of bands here, as well as the professor in several courses, because, we don't just have one head. But I wanted to make sure that I put emphasis on some of the things that she said. So this topic is important because it helps us preserve our Black history at our HBCU, because we run into a lot of problems where the students aren't learning about it. They don't know where to go. They can't find out where it is in the main library because there's no specific where, I guess it's supposed to be a specific place where there's a music section, but the music section only has a few books. But in here, I wish I could just turn the camera around and you guys could see how lovely it is in here. We have a whole library full of just books and stuff for them to look at. Historically, the Black musicians here at this university and a lot of other HBCUs were often excluded from the mainstream academic and performances spaces. So HBCUs became centers for innovating the Black musical traditions that could thrive. However, sometimes that stuff was neglected, but it's okay. We have Ms. Nurhak who's helping us preserve that, and our students have access to it 24/7. Now, I say 24/7 because she's here opening up the doors when we're all going home. Well, not me. I'm here with her. I'm looking at my notes. I'm sorry. I didn't want people to think that the music literacy that we wrote about was just about reading books, because me as the band director, I do come in here a lot looking up stuff that may be relevant, because we assume that music is only going to cover like the classical, the jazz, but you got hip hop, you got electronic, you have, whatever the genre they want to listen to, it's available. And we try to make sure that they know that there's information on those kind of genres in this library and just in the space where they can just come up and look at it. Some of the challenges that our students do face is helping them develop the technical and artistic skills. Well, the library is not going to do that. They got to get in the practice room for that, but it's okay. We're helping them do that as well. Connecting to the music literacy of today, another reason this topic is important is because today's music landscape is constantly evolving. Our students aren't just using, like I said, the jazz and the classical. We want to treat those genres we don't want to treat those genres like they're a separate academic standard. They can come here and they learn about the hip hop sampling copyrights. Students learn how modern artists are now doing it now, because they don't understand that a lot of the stuff that they're putting out there when they're sampling just to be cute on TikTok is actually copyright infringement, but they don't know that, but they're learning it here. Ms. Nurhak is a great source to make sure that they understand that, because she'll tell them if they come and ask. We also have other professors that do that. I'm not one of those professors that knows about the copyright, so I stay in my lane and just do what I do. I think she talked about empowering our next generation of musicians and scholars. Now, I think that's important because knowledge is power. When our students know how to access, analyze, and apply musical resources, they don't just become better musicians, they become informed artists, critical thinkers, and cultural leaders. That way they can preserve the past, shape the present, and create future music. At HBCUs, we are not just teaching students to play music, we are preparing them to understand, innovate, and advocate for music in a way that honors their heritage and drives the industry forward. So I don't have anything else to say, but I thank you for listening, and I'll wait to see if you have any questions near the end. Thank you.
Awesome. Oh.
Hi, everyone. I think I'm up next. I'm Karen Olson, and I am the Research and Instruction Librarian for Music and Fine Arts at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. And my chapter is called Using Stephen Foster's Statue to Teach Critical Information Literacy. For those of you who are wondering what Stephen Foster statue, here's some background information. In the year 1900, the city of Pittsburgh put up an outdoor statue of the composer Stephen Foster, which was paid for with public support and designed by the Italian sculptor Giuseppe Moretti. Stephen Foster was an extremely popular American songwriter in the late 1800s who wrote all kinds of songs, from minstrel songs to parlor songs. And the Pittsburgh connection is he was born in Pittsburgh. In 2017, inspired by the larger run of protests against public statues of Confederate leaders, many people in Pittsburgh wanted this statue to be removed. The protesters thought that the statue pretty blatantly depicted cultural appropriation and that it literally shows Stephen Foster writing down the music being played by the black man seated at his feet. Foster had been accused of whitewashing black music for white audiences, and the protesters thought that this statue made those accusations visible as well as audible. Pittsburgh news outlets covered this story very heavily. They published articles, broadcast opinion pieces, letters to the editor, all kinds of material coming out in the press. And many of these are readily available in library news databases. The people of Pittsburgh came up with all sorts of suggestions for what should be done with the statue, ranging from doing nothing and just leaving it there, adding an explanatory plaque, moving the statue indoors so it wasn't quite so public, moving it indoors and adding an explanatory plaque, just hiding it away forever in storage, even just straight up destroying the statue. Eventually, what happened was that the city council moved the statue, removed it, put it in storage, although it has been loaned out for use in public exhibitions of controversial art. So what does this all have to do with my book chapter? Basically, what my chapter is 6 information literacy lesson plans using the statue and media accounts of the controversy. And each one of these lesson plans is tied to a particular frame within the ACRL information literacy framework. So, for example, for the frame Scholarship as Conversation, I asked students to review and summarize multiple news accounts from different points of view of the statue controversy and to turn those news accounts into an actual conversation by writing a brief play. So my favorite result from this project was a little miniature courtroom drama with the statue on trial. I have found the Stephen Foster statue to be a really useful classroom example to give students practice in researching sensitive questions, in synthesizing multiple points of view, and drawing connections between current events and the music of the past. I also think that it's really helpful to model what could be fairly straightforward information literacy one-shot sessions using a DEI topic as a way of subtly signaling to these students that I am open to having these sorts of conversations with them and that I'm open to supporting research topics that have a DEI angle. So that's the brief overview of my chapter. If you have more questions, feel free to ask them at the end, but I'm going to pass it over to Holling now to talk about his work.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a real honor for me to contribute to this fantastic book. The chapter that I co-wrote with Sarah Manis, who is director of the Weeks Music Library at the University of Miami, is titled Information and Literacy Beyond the Binary. And I really, really enjoy co-writing with my coworkers and colleagues because it always brings new perspectives and ideas to my writing. And it always causes me to think about topics in a new way. And that certainly happened in this case. I also appreciate the discussions that happen when you're co-writing with someone. And Sarah and I had some fantastic conversations during this process, many of which I think are reflected in our chapter. So we had 2 goals for our chapter, Information Literacy Beyond the Binary. And the first was to give practical tips on creating an inclusive environment for transgender, gender diverse, and non-binary students. The second was to give prompts for readers to reflect on their own experiences with gender and gendered spaces and try to discover how that informs their teaching and instruction. As a trans person myself, I'm always hoping to create a better experience for younger folks and people that come after me than what I had growing up. So you never know what a student has experienced that day or that week prior to showing up in an instruction session that you're leading. And microaggressions sort of accumulate over time for trans people, maybe that day or maybe that week. And not to mention that many trans and non-binary students also hold other marginalized identities that have caused stress. So when we have a trans or non-binary student in our classrooms, we're trying to create a positive environment and not add to that heavy load that many of them are carrying around. So in our chapter, we tried to offer tips on how to create a positive, safe, and inclusive environment. For those of you who know me, I always have to talk about my dogs. So I'm going to talk about my dogs for a minute, and I promise that I'll bring it around to still stay on topic. So I have 2 dogs. They're Pumik. Pumik is plural for Pumi. So when there's 1 dog, it's Pumi. When there's 2, they're Pumik, because they're Hungarian herding dogs. And their herding instinct is still very much in place. So they are constantly scanning their environments for threats. They're very attentive to what people and animals are doing around them. And they're very smart, and they're looking for clues that something may be unsafe or maybe on the horizon or something that's about to happen. And as I'm watching them do this behavior, I'm thinking about trans people and how we do exactly that same thing. So when we're in any sort of environment, classroom, out in the community, at church, anywhere, we're looking for clues to see if we are in a safe environment. And usually those clues they're in a form of language. So there are both easy and more complicated things that we can do to create a safe environment for trans people. And there are many of these ideas that I hope you'll find in our chapter that can be helpful. Let me name just a few of them. Always use a person's name that they go by and not what you might see in a class roster or on their email. Use a person's correct pronouns, and if you don't know what those are, start by using your own and then asking them what theirs are. Don't use terms like ladies and gentlemen, or divide a classroom into groups by those designations, boys or girls, or guys and dolls. I hope nobody would ever use that, but that's a music joke. Never out a trans person or tokenize them in a classroom setting, unless you've had a conversation before that meeting where you've talked to them about a particular topic and that person feels very comfortable and safe in adding to the conversation. And don't use outdated terminology. It really messages unacceptance or that you're not trying to create a safe environment. And if you're looking for a place to consult for terminology, I always recommend the GLAD Media Guide, and that's included as a footnote in our chapter, and it's really the best place to keep up with current terminology. We have listed on pages 92 and 93 in our chapter a list of challenges that students may be experiencing. There's so many, and some of them are unique to a student's own situation. But if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to read those challenges. So there are times in our chapter when we ask readers to pause and reflect, and we wanted to give readers some time to think about their own experiences with gender. So everyone has a different experience of gender based on a lot of different things, like your family of origin, what you were taught or experienced growing up, maybe your faith tradition, whether or not you have trans people in your family or community, and of course, your own gender identity. So we all arrive at different places. Some of us never arrive at a specific gender, and it really never hurts to stop and reflect on that and things that we hold on to and how they may evolve over time. Sarah, and I'll give her lots of credit for this, she was very intentional about wanting to include tips for how to recover or apologize when one makes a mistake with a trans person or non-binary person. So we had a lot of good conversations about this and what is the best method or ways to approach this. And we both acknowledge that it's really easy to make a mistake and it doesn't help to beat yourself up, but the best thing to do is just keep learning, apologize for your mistake, and try to do better the next time. I shared with Sarah that I have been, when someone makes a mistake, they read a dissertation for hours often about how they're trying, what they're doing, what work they're doing on themselves, how they're learning about gender. And that just really makes the problem, I think, a little bit more complicated and draws a lot more attention than just apologizing and moving on. So on a more serious note, I'm really deeply worried about the transgender and non-binary youth in our country right now. They're under attack by our current president, and I think this is devastating to their mental health. While campaigning, he spoke countless lies about trans people that I really thought were well in the past, and empowered people to take actions to discriminate and other trans people. I think this is causing great harm and injury to our youth. They're feeling disempowered and fearful of what their future holds. So no doubt this is going to show up, if it hasn't already, in our college classrooms for many years to come. I really think it already is showing up. I wanted to mention a survey you may have heard about. It's called the Trevor Project's National Survey on LGBTQ Youth Mental Health. It was done in 2019, but I think it's still very relevant. And the survey was done to examine the impact of acceptance from multiple types of adults on reducing suicide attempts among LGBTQ youth. So using data from thousands of respondents, this research shows that youth with at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in the past year. So I really hope that we as librarians and instructors can be those accepting adults for trans folks. We can use our empathy, our life experiences, and skills in classroom instruction. It matters. It really does. And now I'll turn it over to Tim Keller, who has an amazing Nashville bluegrass beard. I don't know if he plays bluegrass or not, but I'll turn it over to him to talk about subject headings.
No, but I did have a short-lived stint as a fiddler after years and years of classical violin stuff. I quit playing for a long time and then took up fiddling instead. So that's a whole other story. But
Nice.
yeah, so the beard's just good for Northeast Ohio weather. It's nice and cold here. Not right now, but it's beautiful. So I'm here today to talk about our chapter, which was about flagging problematic subject headings inside of our library systems. And our chapter talks about kind of the nascence of this, where in our consortial relations with the 5 colleges of Ohio, we were having a discussion around what to do about the term illegal aliens, because that was very of the moment when we were discussing it. And that was sort of the birth of this larger conversation around addressing the rest of the problematic terminology that exists, because classification systems are inherently biased and rife with all kinds of problems. And as librarians, I'm sure you're all familiar with those, so I don't have to go into the lengthy, hideous examples of all the terrible things that well-intentioned or not catalogers have been able to fix or have created accidentally across time. And, catalogers now are working diligently to correct. But that's part of this. That's part of this conversation in this chapter is like, as we look at these difficult terms, or even for concepts that don't exist. So sometimes problematic doesn't mean that it's offensive. It means that it's minimally represented. So you might have a concept that this happens a lot with like LGBT stuff, where it's just subsumed into like LGBT. And I'm like, okay, well, there's like a litany of stuff underneath that. So what exactly does that mean? And that kind of expands outward into basically every category. We even talk about it here in this chapter with respect to the usage of the term world music. So that's how we kind of tied this conversation around into the music pedagogy side of things, because like in the broadest sense, you might accidentally kind of erase a more specific instance of a different type of music, or something that could be better represented by a more specific term by giving it too broad of a term. Maybe you don't have the subject knowledge you need to represent that accurately, so you do what you think is best, and you apply a term that's incorrect, and consequently create a problem that you didn't intend to create necessarily. So well-intentioned, but maybe sort of benign neglect in that case. So we took this larger conversation and we thought, how can we turn this into something that is helpful to a dialogue with researchers, with other librarians? And it kind of coincided with Twitter at the time, before it was what it is today. Having flagging for all of the president's problematic things there. So it had the little red flag that says, hey, this is probably not true at all. Disclaimer. And we thought, that's a really great idea. How could we do that? So through some brilliant scripting, thanks to Ben and a couple of other colleagues, I think, for finessing that, we wound up with a way to have a script inside of our Sierra instance that would put little red flags next to terms from a list of problem terms, which we gathered from the cataloging lab. If you're not familiar with that, that was an initiative from Violet Fox. If you don't know Violet Fox, she's amazing, and you can look her up after all of this. But we took our list of terms from the crowdsourced list from the cataloging lab and applied that into our system. And so for each of the things on there, a little red flag would pop up next to it. And when you hover over the flag, it would tell you, hey, we recognize that this term is potentially offensive or, misrepresentative of things or what have you. Like, here's ways you can find more information. And then we had conversations with our research librarians. Hey, if somebody comes up and says, I noticed this red flag, here's where you can point them to an explanation, or here's how you can turn that into a dialogue. And so all of this is drawn out of decades of research that exists out there, starting like with our literature review here in this conversation, goes back to Sanford Berman's Prejudice and Antipathies, which is a fantastic paper that talks about the list and litany of offensive and outdated and omitted language in Library of Congress subject headings. That was all the way in the 70s. And then that conversation is carried forward through a number of other researchers. Ours focused primarily on Berman, also Olson, who talks about the fact that we think that we have a way of controlling things, and we really don't have a way of controlling things. And so that's where we create dialogues around things that basically, because of like the diverse nature of our users, there's ways for us to poke holes in the power structures or the system structures to create ways for that power to leak out from our very chokehold, like hold that we have on that as librarians. We're gatekeepers of this in a lot of ways. Again, well-intentioned or not, that's what ends up happening. So by opening up our technologies in subversive ways, by stretching the rules of how things are applied, by applying something other than LCSH. So again, you could use different taxonomy like Homosaurus to kind of help supplement these problem sides of LCSH or DDC classification and create space for marginalized communities, et cetera, to kind of create a dialogue and make sort of a critical process for ameliorating all of this. And then off of that, we also have Emily Drabinsky. So Drabinsky's approach was, rather than whitewashing things or correcting or fixing or pretending that this stuff doesn't exist, and this came up in our Ohio 5 conversation as we were kind of fleshing this all out. This was, again, the pedagogical approach of creating intervention or dialogue with researchers and patrons to kind of explain why these things exist the way that they are. So in a research librarian's case, you already teach them the critical thinking approach to how they're addressing the information they're taking in or what sources they're utilizing for their research. And so in the same way, you can apply that to how they utilize subject headings. So we didn't end up fixing anything. We fixed a couple of things. As Library of Congress makes changes, so illegal aliens has been changed. Primitive art was another recent one that was changed, and that was because it largely represented anything that wasn't Western art. So you can see how that could be a huge problem and also dramatically misrepresentative of a variety of art forms. That we keep up with those changes. So that's just a system update that happens periodically. You find out Library of Congress has made a change to it. You update the subject heading to reflect the current usage. And that's easy enough. The flagging is updated in the same way. So we regularly consulted with the list on Cataloging Lab. And as it's updated and changes, we reload that into our system and it reflags as necessary. There's an interesting change coming with the consortial-wide, statewide migration from III Sierra to Ex Libris Alma, because now we don't really know how any of these things are going to work. But I've been told that Ex Libris has some approaches for, I think they dubbed it DEI-related approaches to this. And I know that Sarah might be on the call, but wasn't able to talk with us today. But like one of the things that came up in our ERNL presentation around this same stuff in this book chapter was basically in the Q&A, people were saying, hey, what is Ex Libris doing that's like this? What is this publisher doing that's like this? And there weren't a lot of rapid answers. So what we quickly found was that we were probably one of the first people to actually approach this particular problem in this way, which was a really cool, unique kind of case study in how to go forward with all of this. So, with respect to all of this, I guess the questions at the end of our chapter turned into the best conversation starters. As you think about what we've had in here and what we've talked about, what are ways that you can poke holes in your power structures? What are subversive techniques that you can apply within reason without being too subversive that make change? What are ways you can create dialogue and engage in a broader discussion that would, structure future pedagogies so that this isn't as much of an issue? Because we can't go back and fix the past necessarily, but we can start with something, acknowledge what it is, disempower the bad thing, and then empower the next thing moving forward so that we don't have this continuous cycle. So that's everything that I had for today. And that leaves me moving things on to Gary.
Hey, meow. Yes, herding cats. That's what editing is. Thank you guys, Dyani and Kathleen, for herding this wild pack of cats. My chapter is on decolonizing the American orchestral stage, and it's spawned quite a bit of debate at home because we're having the argument of how do you decolonize something that's a colonial practice. This really took a two-point kind of approach. First was the kind of revisiting the foundation of this special collection. As historian, an historian is a time traveler, and any time travel movie you see, they are always talking about don't change anything. Even the smallest change can make the biggest difference. And that's one of the things that actually made me appreciate this collection so much more, was all of the small changes that led to big differences. Our collection was founded by Edwin Fletcher, who was an industrialist here in the city. He was an amateur violinist, and he and his family were concerned about the children of the workers in their factories, and they wanted to provide them creative things to do. And his brother formed the art school that's still here in the city, and Edwin formed a training orchestra. He bought everything he could get his hands on. When we look at the repertoire, the initial repertoire was everything. It was things that were published. And amongst that, we had 7 Latin American composers. We had 3 African American composers. It was a small amount, but the funny thing about it created an irony in my studies, because when I go back to the original catalog, there is no designation whatsoever as to who is African American or Latin American or Italian or German. It doesn't matter. He just mixed them all together. So there became a weird thing about doing the research and having to segregate after the fact to try to identify what was special about this small change that he had instituted. Over the years, this collection has come to bring in other items. During the WPA, we specifically focused on Pan-American composers, recognizing that they weren't largely published, and took an active role in writing to them, asking them for their scores, and having professional copyists here create the full performance sets like these behind me. Each one of these boxes contains an orchestral score, as well as all of the parts that would need to be physically on the stands for an orchestra to play in. We've got over 20,000 of these, and we're still growing. Over the time, we also have been in a position where, for example, when the Women's Philharmonic in San Francisco went out of business in the early 2000s, one of the things they did was they called us about this sizable chunk of music that they had left over that was going to be either tossed or picked apart. We took the entire collection. In that collection was a composer who's come to light recently, Florence Price. Amongst our circulations, we made sure that it could get printed. We got it in shape to get it on the stage. It went out to New York. Somebody in New York wrote an article on her, found more information on her, and the next thing you know, she just exploded across the nation. That same year that she was exploding across the nation, Schirmer called the family and made a deal with them. And I got a call from Shermer in October of the year that we had about 38 circulations scheduled. And they said, we've just signed the family. We now have all the rights to Florence's stuff. Could you please send us copies of everything that you have? And by the way, you can't circulate anything anymore. And I get people who are very angry over that. And for me, it was a matter of, well, no, it just gives me a moment of discovery. We've done the job that we needed to do. We gave Florence a boost into that public eye. And you know what? Now I can find somebody else here who deserves that. And we continue to work on those kinds of things. A lot of this is founded in my undergraduate studies. As a guitarist, I was given the same repertoire everybody else was. But I wanted something different. I like new music. People like new music, and I like to hear things that I hadn't heard before. One moment really came from when I saw the Simon Bolivar Orchestra perform, and they looked like all my cousins. They looked like all my family, and there was a warmth and almost a tearfulness that hit me that I realized when people see people that look like them on the stage, it creates a connection. It gives something meaningful. What happens when you hear music from people that are like you, like your family? And that's been an overriding motivation for us. In these most recent years, actually, what we're working on right now, let me kind of connect something here. As historians, time travelers, you don't change anything. And yet here we are in this point in time, and let me change everything. Let me do big changes. Let me do something that has an impact. And even if they are little changes, I look for them to be some kind of a big impact as we move forward. In the past few years, we took on the entire corpus of works by Louis Ballard, who is he's an Indigenous American composer, regarded as the first Native American to complete an advanced degree in composition. He had published all his own music. After his son died and the family didn't really want to try to take this on, it moved over to us. And last year, I think it was, Fort Smith Orchestra, Fort Smith Symphony, the conductor John Jeter did a Naxos recording with 4 works that we provided, getting that Ballard back in, and it became world premiere recordings. Naxos has asked us if we would do that again for next year. So right now I'm having meetings with John and with the granddaughter of Louis Ballard, and we're preparing materials in order to do another set of world recordings next year. And it's these little things that are really so incredibly satisfying to me. It's an opportunity to really make a change, to make an impact on the stage. As I think about music literacy and students, this is the way that many of the students out there are going to hear literature they hadn't heard before. And knowing that we exist and that we're here as a resource to help springboard all kinds of research. Like I said, over 20,000 of these things sitting behind me. There's a lot of research to be done here. There's a lot of stories to uncover. And there's a lot that can come into making those changes in the future and give historians that perspective on what we did to make it all better. So that's where our chapter is at, about not only recognizing where we come from in a world of diversity. Fortunately, we're blessed with that, but also having an opportunity to make significant changes about what's on stage. Give everybody something else to hear. All this stuff was written to be played. Let's get it out there.
That's great. Thank you so much. So you all have just experienced, like half of the chapters in this book. And I have to say that these authors have worked tremendously hard to make sure that their topics create applications for all of us, right? And Dyani and I just have big love and huge kudos for all of these authors, because one thing that's been really special is that with all of their chapters, they're creating a kind of guidepost, and for somebody who's not an expert in that area, that's hard to do on your own. So they're giving you this gift. The other thing that I think is really special is that each chapter ends with a short bibliography for further reading, and of course, each chapter already has footnotes. So you get double whammy of resources that you can check out. And then several people have mentioned, I know Holling mentioned that each chapter that is included in the book also includes a series of questions for discussion and learning and pondering. So these conversations can help us as music librarians impact both our teaching and creating space that works for our users and increases our own understanding of these topics as well.
Sophie, thanks again for having us. And thank you for the work that you do to share the cutting edge publications from Library Juice Press. It's really been a privilege. And I think that we have time maybe for one question, maybe two, if there are questions from folks here for the panelists. I think there's a Q&A section. Anybody wants to type in?
Let's see. So we have a question here. Sophie, are you fielding the questions or am I?
Why don't you?
Yeah, please do feel free. And
Okay, so we have a question here from Gwen Oseberg, and this is a question for Tim or anybody else who has experience with subject headings. You mentioned using authority subject headings from less commonly used organizations like Homosaurus. How do you think they compare to user-generated subject headings for respectful representations of collections? That's a great question.
That's a great question. And it's kind of a mixed bag answer because I think it depends is the correct answer, is that it sort of depends on where you're getting those, say, user-generated headings. There are ways that if you aren't, for instance, a PCC library, you can contribute suggestions for subject authorities inside of LC with something like I mentioned with the cataloging lab. That's a great resource for exactly this sort of thing because that is all crowdsourced. Those are a mix of professional librarians and basically anybody who's ever been affected by a negative subject heading coming in and saying, hey, like this isn't right. Here's what is currently in usage or what is lacking. There might not exist, the subject heading where it might not exist. So I would say start with something like Cataloging Lab. So in that case, that is crowdsourced. That is kind of not really even, I don't think, officially vetted by anybody, but it is a bunch of librarians keeping an eye on things. Or like I said, you have Violet Fox, who's big in the field with respect to all of this, keeping an eye on these things. Etc. Although she's not the arbiter of all of it, so it's still open to everybody. But so I think in general, I think it's definitely a possibility for the future. How that gets integrated, especially in say an academic setting, who knows? But it's a possibility.
Sophie, thank you, and thank you to Library Juice Press. Hope y'all have a good afternoon.